Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing another Decan deck collection where I'm going to share with you the decks that feel like Scorpio energy, I think. And I always preface these videos with the I think because looking at my decks through an astrological lens is not something that I am familiar with or anything that I actively do in my practice. So it's been really interesting to look at my collection and the decks in this way because it's not a thing that I normally do. I don't actually incorporate a lot of astrology into my tarot practice. So it's been an interesting experience. Now I'm following along with the Decan Walk that's being hosted this year by my friend Marlena Teresa. I will leave a link to all of her information down below for you if you want to jump into the Decan Walk. You can do so at any time. You don't have to wait for it to restart or anything. It's kind of like a continual thing that goes on year after year. So this year, there's a group of us doing it together, which has been really, really fun. But I gotta tell you, I am struggling with the Decan energy as it relates to seasons. And I was having a whole conversation with Marlena about it. And I think it's because my practice is so seasonally ingrained already. And it's very rooted into the place where I live and my own personal weird intricacies of my practice. And so it was really interesting because we were talking about the Five of Cups in Scorpio season, and this is just not Five of Cups time for me. I love October, November, December, so I definitely don't feel like that sort of sat with me in terms of my own personal energy. But I am really enjoying looking at it in relation to the tarot cards, like Scorpio being in relation to the Five of Cups. I think that's really interesting. I think that's a really cool layer to add into the tarot. It's already built into the Rider-Waite-Smith system because it does use Western astrology as a foundational building block for its particular structure. So it's been really interesting to look at it in that way, and it's been quite the struggle actually to look at my tarot deck collection through this lens, because I definitely see my decks in terms of seasonal energy, like the four main shifts of the season as I experience them where I live, as well as decks that have very specific purposes and are tied into specific practices in my particular way of working with tarot. So it was interesting, and the main reason I bring this up is because as I'm sitting here looking at the decks, and I have 8 for you today, 4 indie and 4 mass market, as I'm looking at the decks that I've selected for Scorpio energy, the majority of them actually live in the basket of decks for my dark moon practice, my dark goddess practice, my sort of what some people would call shadow work practice. So I have the majority of the decks that I've chosen actually came out of that basket. So it's really interesting to me to look at how that collection of decks that live in that basket are the ones that I chose to resonate with Scorpio energy. So let's take a little peek in this book, and this is the one that I've been using. It's not a book geared towards tarot and astrology. I have lots of those books as well, and I am using those for reference in the Decan study, but because I wanted to kind of get beyond the individual card energies and focus more on the overarching energy of each astrological sign, I decided to use this one instead. So it's The Stars Within You, A Modern Guide to Astrology. This was the one that I used to kind of first, let's not light my book on fire, that I used to first kind of get a feel for working with astrology. And really, I bought this when I was working through my own chart. But we've been using it all year long for the Decan deck collection as well. So this time around, we're looking at Scorpio energy. So in this book, it says it's relates it to the shaman. So there's an archetypal energy that it relates to. The ruling planets are Mars and Pluto, planets of sexuality and power. The symbol is the scorpion. The main descriptors are passionate, destructive. I love those two dualities. That's awesome. While speaking of duality, the duality is feminine. The element is water. The quality is fixed. The keyword is I create. So we have other correspondences here. in this particular book, like color and attributes and body parts and things like that. And then down here, there's the drive, and it is to transform. And that, I think, was where I kind of landed, that a lot of the decks that I chose are in that basket or in that energy of decks that I use for that kind of deep underworld transformation work. So that's kind of the energy that I was coming at for this particular video in this little mini collection of Decan decks. I would love to know, as always, what resonates for you, and definitely let me know in the comments below. All right, so let's jump in. We're going to start with the indie decks because those are the ones that I am the most sure about. So the first deck that came to mind, and I even wrote it on a sticky note and put it in the book months ago, because when I was flipping through the book and looking at the different astrological signs, I hit Scorpio and I went, oh, that's Black Lily. So that's what I have here to share with you to start this journey. This is the Black Lily Tarot. This is an indie deck, and as far as I know, it's still available. Nudity warning on most of these decks that I'm going to share with you today. I absolutely adore this deck. It is the deck that I feel like is the inner truth teller. That's what I call it. It's kind of like your, not your inner critic, but your true inner voice. The one that it knows what's up and it doesn't have a lot of patience for your BS. So don't even bother trying to BS this deck. It's just going to tell you as it is, how it sees things. And I love its brutal honesty. And I feel like that's kind of an energy that I get with Scorpio. It's kind of brutally honest. I don't know if that's a descriptor that anybody else would use, but I'm thinking of some of the people that I know in my life that are Scorpios, and they are brutally honest. That is this deck on occasion. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore this deck. I would never say it's nasty or mean or anything like that, but it is full on brutally honest. And it's the things that I sometimes don't really want to face, but I need to face. It's the stuff that I need to know, right? It would sit right in here in alignment with Barbara Walker. That's another deck that I think would fit really well in this category. I didn't grab it. I feel like maybe I've shown it in another category. That might be a case for one or two other decks here, but decks can have multiple energies. That's cool. But I just feel like this deck just kind of the one deck in my collection that if I had to say is a Scorpio deck, it would be this one. And again, me not being an astrologer, not having a very vast knowledge of astrology, I'm uber beginner here. That's just my hot take on it. That's just the energy that comes to mind for me. I do not know if that's what anybody else would see, but that's how this deck where this deck would fit for me. So it was immediately the first one that came to mind. I absolutely adore this deck, but it is one that sometimes I have to be in the right frame of mind for. I do find that pairing this with other decks can either tone it down or amp it up. So I always keep that in mind. It's one of the reasons why I love pairing my decks, because I can either amplify or tone down the energy of a deck. So depending on what I pair it with, I can either really amp up that inner truth teller sort of energy, or I can kind of soften it a little bit. It also feels very feminine, something about black background. I think I've got that kind of as a theme as well. Most of the decks that I chose have dark, if not black backgrounds. And it feels like that's just, I don't know, that just feels Scorpio to me for some reason. Maybe it's because of where it hits in the time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. It starts getting really, really dark here in October and November. And so that just makes me think of nighttime skies. So anyway, I've about flipped through the whole deck as I've rambled here about how I feel, how I see this deck. And again, it's the one deck that immediately came to mind when I was ooh, Scorpio decks. Yup, Black Lily. That's my Scorpio deck in my very limited, very beginner knowledge and understanding of astrology. So another deck that also came to mind, and again, this one, actually all four of the indie decks that I'm going to show you live in that basket I was talking about, where I have my deep, dark, transformational decks. There's a lot of other decks in there, but these first four all live in that basket. This one is the Pythonic Tarot. I have edged my copy. And it is, again, another deck that I feel like really sits firmly in that space of transformative energy, because this particular deck, the artwork, the way that it reads, it feels like a very deep transformative experience to work with it. It's not one that I actually work with lightly. Actually, none of these decks that I'm going to share with you, these first 4 anyway, are decks that I would consider working with lightly. These are decks that I take my time with, decks that I dive deep into, and decks that really resonate with that deep, creative, transformative energy. The first 3 here, I think sit really firmly in that feminine space as well. I think they are predominantly feminine with very few masculine presenting figures in them. So in that way, they really sit in that energy. But this is one that I just absolutely adore for that deep transformative work. Again, it's a deck that I use a lot when I'm working with the Dark Goddess. If I'm doing deep, personal, inner transformative work, this is one of the decks that I will go to. I have several, and it kind of just depends on like my mood and the energy that I'm looking to tap into. This one delivers its messages a little softer than like the Black Lily does, and it hits in a different space. This one feels more tied into my spiritual practice, and the Black Lily feels more tied into like more of the mundane world, so like my everyday life. This one I use really specifically for when I'm working through things with my spiritual practice, or I'm working and diving deep into that, or working on deep transformative energies that relate to that sort of work. So it's just a beautiful deck. I think this one is currently out of print at the moment, but it does come back on occasion. So I'll leave a link just in case if you want to keep an eye out for it. It's definitely, I think, worth getting if it's something that resonates with you. It's beautiful, and it reads wonderfully. Like, look at that devil. I love just looking through this deck too. This is one of those decks that I'm just like, I could sit here and flip through the cards and just look at all of the images again, because I just think they are stunning. Also really love the interpretations in this particular deck. But like, as far as like Scorpio energy, I feel like this has it as far as, you know, I understand it, or as I experienced it in that book. And really the key thing that I'm tapping into with a lot of these decks is that transformative energy, but on that like really deep sort of level, right? Like kind of dipping into shadow work a little bit, but also sitting in alignment with that spiritual energy. Okay, so the next deck that I have to share with you is the newest in my collection. Not only just like in this little collection of decks, but like in general. It's very, very new to my collection, so I've just now started playing with it. And this is the Witch's Tarot. Again, this is an indie deck. This one's by Burning Paper Hearts. I forget to say who decks are from all the time. Sorry about that. Here's the backs. Sometimes I forget to show those too. This one did come edged in black, which is lovely. And it has got like rose petal finish, but it's thin and flexible, and it just shuffles like a dream, I just have to say. This deck is photographic, and it is stunning. It's stunning photography. I really have been enjoying getting to know this deck. And again, looking at that really deep, transformative, internal, kind of shadowy work. That's sort of what I just keep picking up with this Scorpio energy. This definitely hits in that spot. Again, also very feminine presenting. It is powerful. At this point, I'm not like entirely ready to articulate how it reads, because I'm just starting my work with it. There are extra cards, and I have kept them in here. So like there's a Hecate card, which is fantastic. So I don't really feel like I can comment a lot on how it reads yet, but just on like surface level, just looking through it, this just kind of resonates with that energy for me. It feels deep and dark and transformative. It's very feminine. It also feels very like creative, and it is what I feel like is going to be a very empowering deck as well. Like it's going to be where like the inner, like the Black Lily was kind of like that inner truth teller. I feel like this is more like the external. Like this is about like externally speaking your truth, externally living that authentic version of yourself. That's just kind of the energy I get off of it, like at first, first use here, because again, like I said, I'm just now starting to work with this deck. It's again one that I don't think will be like an easy, quick, easy work with deck. I think it's going to require some patience and some and putting the time into doing the work with it. It's not one that I would probably pull out for like a one shot, right? If that makes sense. And in fact, none of these decks really, I don't think would be decks that I would be tempted to just pull out willy-nilly for whatever kind of reading. At least for sure, these first 4 indie decks actually are ones that I would really say that about. The next 4, the mass market decks, actually, I guess some of them I would pull out just willy-nilly kind of a thing. But I feel like these, for whatever reason, I guess my indie decks sit more in Scorpio energy for me than my mass market, because I had a really hard time finding some mass market decks, and I like to do a little bit of both just for that balance. And I had a really hard time finding mass market decks that I felt like sat in that Scorpio energy. Again, as I understand it, and like I feel like I kind of just they might be misses, I don't know, but I feel like my indie decks that I chose like really sit in alignment with that energy. So I was really pleased to be able to pull all of these out. Also, again, like I mentioned, it's so cool that they all kind of live in the same basket. You know, all of those same keywords that I've been saying, you know, for the last 2 decks and that we read in the book. I feel like this deck really hits that space with all of those. It's just stunning deck. I've only just scratched the surface with it. I've enjoyed what I've done so far, and I'm really looking forward to like diving into it even deeper. But I definitely feel like if I had to like, again, pick an astrology sign to stick it in right now, it would be Scorpio. So the next deck is another one that I pulled right out of that same basket, and this is the Somnia Tarot. So maybe there's like a bit of shadow work energy to Scorpio season. I don't know. Here's the beautiful backs. I love this deck. I know this is a deck that's like, it's hit or miss for some people. I absolutely love it. I get a ton working with it. I'm actually really excited to try pairing it with the Witch's Tarot that we just looked at, because I think that's going to be a really interesting sort of combination. Because as I mentioned, I feel like the Witch's Tarot is kind of like that external. And this to me, even though everything is in this outside external place in terms of like what we're looking at, it kind of feels like it reflects the inner landscape. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of put those two together to see what happens. But again, you know, tapping into those same keywords, very transformative, powerful. There is, I think, certainly in the first 3 that we looked at, but even in this deck, I think there is sensuality to these decks too. And I would say it's even here in the Somnia, because this deck is beautiful. It is produced so beautifully that there is just something kind of seductive and sensual about this deck. Even though like we don't have any nudity, I don't think, anywhere in the deck. All the people are like covered in sheets, and or you know, we can't even see their faces or anything. So it's definitely not a nudity type of sensuality, but I would say that this deck is sensual. It's evocative, it's deep, and it is it reaches into those like really internal spaces that are like, in my opinion and in my working with it, that are like crying out for attention. They're crying out for transformation, and like this deck just works so beautifully for that. I wouldn't say it's very feminine. It actually has a little bit more of a masculine leaning feel to me, but it's incredibly creative. It's incredibly gorgeous. Again, another photography deck, and it's just, there's something really special about this deck. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I absolutely adore it, and I feel like it just hits a note in my collection that I don't have anything else that does. And it's so unique in that way. But like it does feel like, again, like a Scorpio energy, again, in my limited knowledge and my current understanding of that energy. And I just think it's beautiful. Look at that 2 of Cups. Love it. Like that's sensual, right? That's beautiful. Sensuality, sexuality does not always mean naked. So I think like this deck kind of like illustrates that. It's sensual without showing skin. Is that a thing? It's totally a thing. Okay, so let's move on to my mass market decks that I've chosen for Scorpio energy. And this one we're going to start here is the Mary L. This is my first edition, but this deck is still currently available in the second edition. And it doesn't have borders, it's borderless. And I think both the cards have been changed in that one. I don't have it, but instead I have 2 copies of this one, but it is still available. This deck, the Mary L does feel like maybe it hits in that Scorpio energy. Again, it's a very deep and transformative deck. And I have done a lot of work with this deck over the years, particularly with that type of energy. Again, it lives in the same basket with all the other decks that I've really shown so far. They all live together because they all kind of work in that space for me, all in their own unique ways, but they all sit in that space for me into the deep dark places of the self and the soul, and they reach in and they help you to change and transform. They help you to step into this more authentic, raw version of yourself. Like, again, trying to explain that stuff is just like difficult because it's a personal thing for each of us, right? Not each of us experience transformative energy in the same way. We don't experience decks in the same way. It's one of the things that makes it so interesting about doing like deck collections that are thematic like this, because what is, one thing to me may be something totally different to you. But again, back to the Mary L. I love this deck. Like, it's been around forever, and it's kind of like a classic in that sense, and I adore it. I've done a ton of work with it. I haven't worked with it as much in the last, year or two, because I've had some other decks that have come into my collection that I've been using. I wouldn't really say in place of, because like, all of these decks sit in their own unique place. I wouldn't say that any one of them could be replaced with the other one. There's a reason that I have them all, is what I'm trying to get at. And even though I've been gravitating towards other decks for similar type of work, this one definitely has its own unique sort of energy, and I do, different kinds of work with it. But like, I've done this death card, man. Like, this is Scorpio, right? This card to me, and I think this was the card that came to mind when I was thinking about this deck. This card to me embodies Scorpio energy as I understand it, and like, I just think it's beautiful. This deck was one of the decks like years ago that really made me see that a deck can incorporate all the systems and none of the systems at the same time, right? Because it does, it pulls in RWS and Thoth and Marseille, and you can see a little bit of everything. There's some numerological, there's some elemental. It's like all the systems and none of the systems. And it's really cool. I really appreciate that about it, because it's one of the first decks that I think I ever brought into my collection that dared to be different in that way. And like, ever since then, I've had an attraction toward decks that kind of don't fit into any particular system, because like, as we all know, I don't read according to any one particular system, because that's not how I was taught, and that's not how my practice has evolved. I pull from pieces and parts of all of them, but then I integrate them and then work with them in a way that actually works for me and my life and my personal view of the world and things like that. So anyway, that's a side tangent, but I feel like that's all Scorpio energy. I feel like Scorpio's a little bit, maybe I could be wrong, but I feel it's a little bit like rebellious too. I think that was another key descriptor for one of the other energies, but there does feel like a bit of like bucking the tradition with Scorpio. As I've been, reading about it, it's kind of like daring to be different, daring to go its own way, and I appreciate that about it. So yeah, the Mary L is definitely one that, again, I use for very deep, personal, transformative work. But yeah, it was that death card that really just like, that felt like Scorpio in a card. Okay, so another mass market deck that I chose is the Intuitive Night Goddess Tarot. And I don't know if I've shown this one in another sort of category or not, but I thought this one maybe resonated a little bit with Scorpio energy. I have edged mine in green. Here's the backs. This deck, again, is tapping into that sort of nightscape. It's got that goddess energy. One of the things I like about it is it's not actually really tied into any particular goddess or pantheon. So it's kind of like just this idea of global goddess energy, or as I like to see it, universal goddess energy. which does actually really resonate with the way that I work with Goddess in general, or the divine feminine in a general sense. So I really appreciate that about this deck. Also, it does feel, I was about to say introspective, it does feel introspective. These characters are like, there's a single person on the card and they're like kind of amidst this dark starry night background, and they do feel a bit solitary. So for me, this deck invites a lot of introspection. And again, we're looking at that transformative energy in a slightly different way than the rest of the decks we looked at. This deck is much, much softer. It's the softer side of maybe, I guess, Scorpio. It is, again, very feminine. I think it's all feminine presenting figures in this deck. And it's beautiful and sensual. Again, sensual not necessarily meaning naked, although there is a bit of nudity in here. It's just such a beautifully created collage deck, and I really enjoy working with it. It's one that I use a lot, again, for dark goddess work. It's one that I use a lot for dark moon time, things of that nature. It just really resonates with that energy. And again, it does encourage that sort of dive deep within, that get introspective, that dig up that transformative sort of energy. Now I'm wondering if that was even like in the book that we looked at, or I'm just making that up. But that's kind of what Scorpio feels like to me. This feels like the softer side of it though. Like, it's not near as like hard hitting as like the Black Lily. It's definitely, not in that space. It's not as sort of naked as the Witch's Tarot, and I don't even mean like physically naked. Like, it's not as raw as the Witch's Tarot. It doesn't dive as deep as the Somnia Tarot, but it does a really good job of kind of like just holding space for all those things. And that's kind of, I guess, how this deck like reads for me too. It's kind of like a space holder. It creates space to hold things, to hold energies, to hold feelings, to hold whatever it is that you need to hold. And I think it does a really good job of that. So it's one that I enjoy working with. Again, it's kind of like one of those that I pull out all the time, but I don't think to really talk about a lot because it's not like, doesn't thematically fit in with anything I'm doing. It's kind of just one of those that I keep on hand because I pull it into my practice for readings, pretty often when I'm kind of looking for integrating that sort of energy into my work. But again, definitely in that sort of, feminine, sensual, beautiful, but also very kind of solitary and introspective sort of energy. And I think it fits pretty well in this little category for Scorpio. Okay, so for the last two decks, these are the ones that I'm a little bit like, I'm not really sure if that's where these really sit for me, but we're gonna pull them out anyway and talk about them. This is the Tarot de la Nuit. Yes, here's the backs. I've edged mine. I love when I can't remember the names of decks. This deck, to me, does not really lean into the darker shadow in that sense, but I've actually done a full like deep dive talking about this deck because I think that this deck does so beautifully is that it's one thing on the surface and it's something else entirely when you dive beneath the depths of it. And there's a part of that I feel like resonates a little bit with Scorpio energy. Like, you kind of got to get beneath the surface level to really see the depth and really see the understanding that can come through working with these cards in this energy. Again, it's also kind of like the dark backgrounds. It also has that fairy tale energy, which I don't know, it like thinking about fairy tales, like not Disney fairy tales, but like grim fairy tales, right? Old fairy tales. Like, they're pretty dark and like they can be dressed up in this like beautiful overlay like Disney does, right? I'm not trying to knock Disney films. I love Disney movies. I grew up with them. My kids grew up with them, right? Not knocking those. But they do like put this dressing over the top of fairy tales. And this deck kind of shows that idea, but it hints to the fact that they came from something much, much darker. And I absolutely adore that energy. That's, I think, one of the reasons why I really like this deck, because I feel like it's so underrated and you have to kind of get beneath the surface of what you're seeing in order to catch the brilliance beneath it. And the depth and the layer that can come through working with these cards. This is, of course, just my, my experience working with them. Somebody else might have a totally different experience. But what I see here is this idea of you don't really know what's going on when you're just looking at things surface level. Right? And in surface level, things can look perfect. They can look beautiful. But what's going on underneath is, man, some really, really dark things, or, you know, a lot of depth that you wouldn't necessarily see before. I love this Empress. I think she's amazing. Again, so much more going on beneath the surface of this card than if you just take it at face value. And I adore that. And I feel like that's kind of a Scorpio energy. That feels like the chick from the Haunted House Tarot, right? Every time I see that, I think that's her. I mean, obviously we have like references to like pop culture and things like that in this deck, which I mean, I do enjoy as well, but I just feel like that kind of embodies, and that, like, the more I talk about it in that sense, I do feel like it kind of embodies Scorpio energy. It can be very transformative, and even your experience, or at least my experience with working with this deck, has been transformative in and of itself, because I bought it thinking it was going to be one thing and it ended up being something totally different. And it was through that experience that my relationship with this deck was like transformed. It's also very sensual and very feminine and very beautiful, and I feel like those are all energies that really resonate with that sort of Scorpio vibe as well. So yeah, it's one that I really enjoy working with, and like I feel like at first glance, this is one of those decks that you could just go, oh, it's one of those. But like there's more going on here. If you take the time to get to know it, there's more going on here, and I absolutely love it. If you want to hear me talk more about this deck, I have a whole video, because clearly I have feels. Okay, and the last deck that I have to share is one that I am almost positive I've shown in another Decan collection. This is the Tarot of the Abyss. And again, I had a lot of trouble selecting decks that I like from my mass market collection that I felt like resonated with Scorpio energy. And I landed here because even though I think I might have shown this one in, it might have something to do with like maybe balance or something along those lines, but here's the backs. I do feel like this could lean into that Scorpio energy, because this deck, in my work that I've done with it, which has not been a ton, it hasn't been in my collection very long, but there's something really deep here as well. There is a lot going on in the cards and within the sort of layer that comes through as you work with them, as the imagery kind of brings itself more forefront in your mind. And I think that it's another one that has that ability to really dive into the transformative energy. This deck for me actually feels more tied into that sort of transformative energy in terms of more of like your emotional landscape. That's how I've kind of found my work with it, is it definitely sort of keys into that sort of energy. It may not have been what I said originally, but that's the thing about working with decks. The longer you work with them, different things end up coming out, or you find layers and things that you didn't see before. Like the more you work with it, the better you get to know it, right? It's like any relationship. The longer you know someone, the more you spend time with them, the better you get to know them, and you get to pick up on their little like intricacies and the little you know, unique things about their personality that set them apart from everybody else. And I feel like that happens with decks too. So like, even though all the decks could kind of sit in the same energy, they all have their own little unique personalities. Sorry, I do personify my decks. Did a whole video with Lisa if you're curious about that whole thing. But this deck, I do feel like sits in that Scorpio energy. It's very transformative. It does have a bit of a feminine feel to it. I think it's also, again, very creative. And I'm trying to think back to what those keywords were that we looked at originally. But it's a beautiful one. I'm almost positive it showed up somewhere else. But it can have more than one energy, right? I mean, decks are kind of like people in that way. They can have multiple aspects to their personality, and I love that. And so I think it's cool to be able to look at a deck and say, yep, it has this energy and it has this energy, and like they all just work together beautifully. Again, I don't have a really great vast knowledge of astrology anyway, so this is me taking a look at it through my very, very beginner, very limited understanding. But it's definitely been interesting to experience my decks in this way because this is not how I work with my decks. And I don't classify them or categorize them in their astrological energies. And I don't really even work with astrology in tarot that much. So it's been a really, really interesting experience and much, much more of a challenge than I thought it was going to be going in. I'll be perfectly honest, I did consider like not doing any more of the Decan deck collections because I feel like my understanding of the energies is so basic and my knowledge is so limited that there's a part of me that feels like maybe I'm doing a disservice to the Decan energy and to the zodiacal experience. That perhaps, you know, in my very limited understanding, in some ways I'm doing a disservice to it. But, you know, this is me as a non-expert, right? Like I'm not an expert in anything. I'm not an expert in tarot. I'm not an expert in astrology or anything like that. So this is me in my non-expert, just everyday sort of working with the tarot lens of trying to figure out how this energy shows up in my collection. And, you know, and if it were to make a difference, if it were to add or anything to my practice, it's been an interesting exercise, but I've definitely learned as we've gotten through. Are we halfway through? I think we're a little over halfway through the Decan Walk now. I've really come to learn that like Decan energy isn't really something that works for me. And I think it's because I'm so tied into my own way of doing things anyway, but I'm going to keep at it because it's an interesting exercise, and doing something different and looking at things through a different lens is a great way to learn and expand your understanding, but also solidify what you already know to be true about yourself. So that's the reason we're going to continue, and I hope you all don't mind. But this is where we're at. So there you go. There's a few of the decks that I've chosen to represent Scorpio energy, I think. I would love to know what decks you would choose or decks you have in your collection that feel like it resonates with this energy. And definitely leave those in the comments below for me. As always, you'll find links for everything I've shown here in the description box of this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.